shoot somewhere. So we tried to round up antelope afoot. Little Jerry could shoot these antelope, and hell, it's wonder he didn't shoot us. But anyway, the war was on, and Jerry and Brownie, they were talking about going in the war. So that fall, they joined up. And there's a story in there about they were at one place over there. I can't remember all the name of the places they were at. So they were like Scott Kittenberg. They walked across Europe. And one of the sergeants hollered quick back. And there was 3 of them answered. And so they were all 3 together.
So they didn't know they were all there?
They didn't know that.
No.
But they all 3 met there.
That was in that book, wasn't it?
Quite a reunion.
Oh, wow.
Then there was another time, I can't remember whether it was like, there was Heggies in the army, and there was courts and you know, lots of boys from Maine. And Rennie Mitchell, who was married to Alice, Mary's sister. I think he was in the trench, and he covered himself up with some kind of a camouflage. And all of a sudden, somebody else jumped in. It was Roy Howard.
You heard that one.
He's from here too?
Brother-in-law's.
Oh, Grandma's brother.
Yeah.
Wow. Or nephew.
Yeah. Well,
Roy's
Ren was married to Alice,
Oh, Roy's
Mary's sister,
brother.
and Roy was Mary's brother. And then so they had a reunion, and then there's a Lloyd Court was in the army, and I think that when they were going into the Diet, that he was going in on the boat, to get ready to fight.
Yeah.
And I guess a shell hit him, and it exploded him. And when he woke up, and he don't know whatever happened, he was in the hospital. And they had found him afloat on a makeshift raft, and they don't know part of the boat.
He was in that water for
Yeah, he
several
was
days.
in the water
before
for
he
several
got
hours.
found, yeah.
And
So, you know, he got blown out of the ship. He didn't
Yeah,
get
he
killed.
got blown
But he
out.
landed on
But there were plenty that probably did get killed.
Not very
you
many
know.
of them made it.
Not very many of them made it.
no,
Yeah, no.
and I was going to tell you one on Jerry Whitbeck. Jerry is my cousin. And they were, Jerry was a paratrooper, and they'd paratroopered into around the Rhine, and they were going to go on a big operation, and the sergeant hollered out, who here can swim? And I go, no. And Jerry hollered out, well, Sergeant, I can swim in the big canal in Raymond. And he says, you're the man. So he had to carry something across the Rhine. They were in a big operation, so he had to swim across the Rhine. And then there was another one of Paul Evans, and this is quite interesting. He was a bombardier in the Air Force, and they got shot down one night. And
He rode in that big bubble, didn't he?
Yeah,
At the back
he,
of the plane.
Oh, that was
Where he was.
scary.
the plane, of course, blew up, And then he says, I woke up and I could hear this whoosh, 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 whoosh. And he was in a bubble on part of the plane and going down towards the earth.
Oh,
And so he says, I come wide awake. And he says, I looked over the side, and he says, I gotta get out of here. And so he rolled off, pulled his parachute, ripcord, and he says, I wasn't very far from the ground, so when I left, he says, I really buggered my ankle up. caught that we had to get rid of our parachutes, bury them or cover them or something. And he said, well, I kept mine. And he says, I always carried a small pair of fingernail clippers. And he says, I had to have something on my ankle, so he says, I clipped some bandages
On the
out of
parachute.
that parachute with those little snippers.
And he had to cut the parachute loose with
Yeah.
those clippers. Cause it hung up in a tree, didn't it?
Yeah. And so he got loose and he from the parachute, and then he went to this house, started out afoot. He says there was German soldiers all over looking for him.
Well, that's why they had to hide the parachutes.
Yeah.
They wouldn't know they were there.
So he got to this house and he said they looked at him and they says, well, we'll get somebody to take care of you. And he says the next thing I knew there was German soldiers showed up. So they took me to the hospital, he said, and doctored me up, and then he said I went to the prison, and it's called camp.
POW.
And he says a group of us decided we were gonna break out, which they always tried to break out of prison when they were over there in the concentration camps. And so he says we did break out, and we were moving along pretty good, he said, but then we got too brave. And he says they picked us up at a train station one night and took us back to camp. And he says they locked us up, and then he said they'd come around every morning and they'd say, we're gonna shoot you tomorrow morning. Tomorrow morning we're gonna shoot you. And so he says they pulled that for quite a while. And he says, I got so that I didn't care. He says, I don't give a damn if they want to shoot me, let them shoot me. Let's get it over with, eh? But they didn't. He went into they put him back in the camp, and so he spent the rest of the war in that camp. And that was the same one that Malcolm Selman,
Yeah,
Frankham,
Yeah.
and Burl Meldon were at.
Yeah.
And they're from Raymond, eh? And so Burl and Franklin, he says we were all starving to death in there. And he says they give us a chance to work in the kitchen. And he says, no darn way, we're not working in no kitchen. And then finally they got so hungry that they went to work in the kitchen.
Yeah, it'd be a good place.
And they spent the rest of the war working in that kitchen. But right beside him, in this one prison camp, there was Russians, eh? The Russian prison camp. And when they come in and the Canadians come in and took these towns over, they let the Russians come in too, yeah. The Russians come in. And they let the Canadian and the US out of this one camp, and they told the Russians, you shouldn't be there, so you're gonna stay there. If you come out of there, we'll shoot you.
The
This
Russians
was
would
the
shoot their
Russians
own?
telling the Russians, they shouldn't have been caught.
Oh,
They
you're
shouldn't be
kidding.
prisoners.
Oh, that's
Isn't
horrible.
that right?
Yeah, I guess.
There was a prison camp right
Yeah.
beside the Canadian and the US camp.
Wow.
Let their own brothers out.
Yeah, yeah.
Teaching them a lesson, eh?
And so, I don't know, there's lots of good stories in that book. And
Why did the Germans honor the whole